Hello, friends, and happy Friday. Thank you for joining the Friday conversation. We're here this week with some guests. And Judith, will you start us off with an introduction, please?
I'm Judith Starkston. I write historical fantasy set in the Bronze Age world of the Hittite Empire, and also a novel set in the context of the Trojan War. So, fantasy and magic in the Bronze Age world is kind of my log line.
We'll get into all that. And our friend Parmeet is here. Thank you for joining, Parmeet. I know it's early for you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm Paramita. I'm a member of the Page Chewing Forum, and I like to read books in a variety of genres: general fiction, classics, fantasy, science fiction, a little bit of historical fiction. I'm very excited to be here and be part of the conversation. Thank you.
Awesome. So I know I was a little bit late to the recording. I know you and Judith had kind of had a chat before I dropped in and got all of my technical issues figured out. So I'll let you start it off with a question you had prepared.
Right. So I had to look a bit at your works, and the first thing immediately that I wanted to ask is, how do you construct your story and the world when there is paucity of primary sources? The era that you're handling with is not profuse in documentation if you were, say, instead writing in the Renaissance period or in Victorian England. So when we are going back to such an era where, there are different types of sources, how does your world building process work?
Well, one of the world that, let's just set the time period and also people know, it's the 13th century BCE in the part of the world that's now Turkey and Syria and Lebanon and parts of Israel. And that was the Hittite Empire. And that's the inspiration. I call it Hittolia instead of the Hittite Empire. So there's a clear reference to the real world, but I'm also owning from right up front, this is fantasy. I let a lot of magic and things like that happen within my fiction. All of those fantastical elements have their sources in the historical moment. So my main character is a member. She's a queen, but she's also she's not a queen in the beginning of my book series, but eventually she's a queen, and she's also a priestess. And so a lot of the things that she practiced and all, we think of as magic. We would identify them as magic. And so I use those things as the rules for magic. Fantasy always has to have a clear set of boundaries and limitations and rules and what can happen. And I use the historical understanding of the period. But then to get to Paramita's good question is, how do I know any of those rules and practices and all? And it's true that there aren't, the Renaissance, there are many more sources, but there's actually large libraries that have been excavated from this world. This is an empire that the reason people don't know much about it is that until the very late part of the 20th century, and then mostly in the last decade or a decade and a half, the archaeology and the understanding of this period, we didn't know about it. It was the lost empire, and it literally got dug up. And some of what got dug up were these cuneiform tablets. And there was at first like, what language is this? I mean, we recognize the cuneiform writing as, the writing system of the Near East, Sumerian and Babylon, all different cultures used this writing system. But in the same way that you can use, the alphabet to write French or Spanish or whatever, we didn't know what language. And it turns out it got deciphered and all of that. And it's related to the Greek. It's ancient Greek, and it's not ancient Greek, but it's Indo-European like that, rather than the languages of the Near East, but just using this Near Eastern system. So now there are all these, like, I can actually, when I want to have her cast a spell or release a curse or something, I can go and read a translation of what somebody thought they should do to make that happen. So in some ways, there's this really precise information. In fact, it might take her 14 days of writes to do that, and that will never work in fiction. Like, you can't make it that long. So there's partly a sorting and getting the good, juicy details, and creating verisimilitude without boring anybody. But there also, we have some of her sort of major marker events of this woman's life. She enters the historic stage in terms of what we know about her when she's 15. And the last written document that we have is she must be in her late 80s. So now the 4-book series, I'm publishing the fourth and final book May 7th. This series starts when she's 15, and it's just the first part. It's when she's discovering who she is and figuring out. So she is, I guess, in the reluctant hero mode. She's the magic that she sees herself wanting to use. She's reluctant to use it because it's forbidden. She's not supposed to. There's certain things as a priestess she's been trained, and other things she's been told not to. And she has to break out of the limitations of her world, but also, she has to, she's very intelligent, and she is working within a fairly patriarchal world, but a world that the Hittite law actually was really liberal about women in a lot of ways. A Victorian woman had way fewer rights than a Hittite woman. So she's legally allowed to do a lot of the things that she rises to do. But so that's the quick version. There's also a lot of archaeology. I mean, when I build a palace in my head, but based on a lot of archaeology and that kind of thing.
Must take a lot of time to look into all that history to be able to put yourself in that mindset of someone in that time period. How much time do you take to really understand how to place yourself in that time period?
Well, I would say that probably this was not the quick study choice of periods. I trained, my degrees are in classics, so Greek and Latin literature and history and all that, which gave me the linguistic knowledge to understand, like, when they talk about the translations of these tablets and all, which are never very clear. It's always hard. You have to discuss, well, could it mean this or could it mean that? That kind of academic stuff I can follow because of my training. And I knew about archaeology and that kind of thing. So partly that I had, training preceding my deciding to write about this world. In the beginning, there was so little written about them. A lot of what I used was very raw archaeological site reports, which are really, really dry and boring. I mean, they're very technical. There's 3 centimeters of mud brick here, and it's just like goes on and on. And gradually now there's some really very relatively accessible sort of overviews of this culture, because I mean, here's this whole empire. It was the primary enemy of the Hittites were the Egyptians. And just to kind of put it in a context of time-wise that people will recognize, this queen, whose historical name was Putuhepa, in my book she's Tesha, so I just call her Tesha. Tesha's primary enemy on the international scene was Ramses II. So, like the pharaoh that Moses, they had their standoff together. That's the period of time. So it's quite a lot. It precedes all the Greek history and all of that. It's about the time of the Trojan War, if to the extent that the Trojan War was a historic thing. And that was my entry drug to Hittites. I was writing about the Trojan War, and silly me, I wanted to know who the Trojans were. And the answer when I was in, grad school and all was, well, they're kind of Greekish, like that's not really what people said, but that's like basically what it boiled down to. Because the whole understanding of what this huge empire was, had just been buried, forgotten, and was gradually coming out. And it's a kind of amalgam culture of, it's a lot of influence from Mesopotamia and places like that, but it's also themselves. Like they are a very distinct cultural tradition in a lot of ways. So yeah, it took years. I would say there was like a good decade of reading and studying, and I was writing drafts and messing around with fiction then too, but I was reading, and I still read a lot and trying. I don't try and keep up the way you would if you were an academic, but so.
Sounds intense.
I mean, while you were telling us about this, I was remembering something about one of my very favorite writers, and I want to pose this question to you. So, Tolkien, he loved languages, and I always find it very, very endearing that he built this world around his love for languages, and then he wrote Lord of the Rings in it. But I mean, his primary love is language and working with that and then constructing the world. And when I was listening to you, I kind of got the feeling that you have a deep love of scholarship regarding these archaeological digs and these sort of finding out about these cultures. And then you constructed your world around it. So is that true? Or was it more you found out about this lady and you wanted to explore how this amazing lady came to be at a time when it shouldn't have been possible? Or, well, at least it was very difficult to be possible. Did the character come first, or did the love for the world come first, or were they both in tandem?
It was character for me that drove. It was first this Trojan War book that I was writing. I was looking at this one woman there and who she was, and I thought,
Was it Briseis?
Briseis, right? The
Yeah,
woman
right.
that Achilles takes as captive,
Yes,
and then she's the cause of.
yes.
And then while I was researching that, I discovered this queen, and I was like, how could I not know about this woman? Like, she
Mm,
ruled the largest empire of the world at the time. She was, we have these great letters of her to Ramses II. She's bossing him around, and don't you tell me that. I mean, not quite like that, because they're very formal and it's stiff language,
mm,
but she takes him to task, and she just absolutely refuses to act. And it's interesting because we have the letters of his wives back to her, and they're just secondary characters on the stage, and she clearly is a primary character. It's interesting how she, as you say, how could she be this powerful person? And there wasn't any limitation on Hittite queens legally, so
mm.
other women could have been like her, but they weren't. They just weren't.
Yes.
um, she is the only one quite like this. There were a couple notorious troublemakers. Well, I'm being facetious with troublemakers. They tried to kill off, this or that heir to the throne so that their sons or, whatever. That kind of, there was part of the appeal of writing about the Hittites is that like all the kind of Game of Thrones drama is right there in history. I mean, it's very much, and in my case, I put griffins, no dragons, but griffins, which they are on all this iconography of the artwork, and their seals have griffins on them. And I was sitting around having good food and beer with some archaeologist friends who dig this world, and they're like, of course you have to have griffins alive and a species. Figure out how you make that work, because of course. So I have the blessing of the most dry historical people imaginable for alive griffins. And they're way fun, way more fun than dragons. Griffins are great. And mine are like the size of buildings. They're, huge. They're
Oh, I
really,
do agree. Griffins are great.
yeah,
They're wonderful.
yeah. Huge lions with eagle heads and giant golden wings. So, I mean, not gold as in metal, but golden colored.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, and they have a whole realm that's a kind of mystically far. They can travel back and forth when they need to, but it's too far and it's barriered from human contact. So I sort of create that. So yeah, there's a lot of fantasy, but I was interested in this woman, and we get these windows into her character from her own letters and her judicial decrees, and those are pretty dry. And that wouldn't be fun fiction, but they're a window into a really powerful, interesting, bright, you know, boundary pushing woman, and I wanted to make a life for her. And I have to say that the sort of when I go visit archaeological sites, and the directors of those sites are like, "Oh, we really want you to do this, because what we do is you bring to life what we do." So that's fun, but
Yes.
I'm mostly writing fiction, and fiction is all about characters and who they are and what they do and what drives them. You have to have the buildings and the clothing and the weaponry, and all of that stuff has to be there. And it has to be, in my case, I want it to be historically right, and I want it to be vivid, and I want to immerse you in that world. But that doesn't drive the story.
Hmm. I sort of wanted to follow up on something which you said, which really resonated with me. She said that in the Hittite Empire, there was legally they were allowed to do, the women were allowed to do a lot of things, but the fact is that many women didn't. And I was trying to think of our contemporary times, irrespective of the nation we belong to. Theoretically, at least the country I am in, we have had female chief ministers, we have had a female prime minister. Similarly, in the United States, we have had women running, but it often doesn't happen as much as it could. And I wonder sometimes whether the stories that you're writing, that all great stories like this, they sort of ring universal. I mean, they still are contemporary, they have contemporary validity. So, how did she, in that time, what was her, what empowered her, what fired her to go for it in the way, that other women didn't? Was that something that you sort of had glimpses from history, or was it something that you had to construct yourself?
I guess I mostly had to construct it myself, because I mean, we know she was really smart, but a lot of women are really smart and are not, not running for president or whatever. And I think it's your observation that, in contemporary Britain and America and all, there's certainly way more men than women and it's only been recently. So, and we do sort of think of history as getting more and more progressive about things like this, but what struck me is that not so much in some ways, because as I said, legally, there weren't all these limits on women. It was still very much a patriarchal society. She could continue to be queen after her husband died, but another king came on. So she was, she was secondary to the king as power. Now, when her husband and she were notoriously, it was a notoriously happy marriage. Like even Ramses and people like that just seemed to be floored by the way they worked together. And I think that is in some ways what appealed to me about her. Her husband was militarily very capable. He had been the younger brother of the great king before, and had been the guy who had fought the battles for his brother, like, pacified situations I mean, the whole capital got overrun and things like that. So he had this track record of military accomplishment, but he became famous for making a peace treaty with Egypt. And where did that come from? Like, how did he become the king who reigned over a long, period of peaceful golden age? And I thought it was a lot because of her, and because he listened to her. She had a separate seal, like the way you signed a document or a law or a whatever, was with a seal that you press into the clay. And she had her own separate one. They had joint seals also, but on the really important documents, they both put their separate seals, which is not typical. So, and it's a symbol of how they were thinking and working. So in some ways, I think there was a collaboration that, boy, isn't that a great model for history? Like, isn't, maybe it takes more than one person to make, an empire go successfully, and more than one model of how you make things work. I have to say that in the arc of my series, one of the things that she has to learn that her husband gets better than she does. I mean, you have to have characters with give and take, they have flaws. She is wants control of, she likes to have everything tidy and, I mean, tidy in the larger sense. I mean, I suppose tidy in the physical sense too, but, and her husband really has to show her, model for her, and she has to internalize that sometimes you have to trust situations and people to let it go along and build a relationship. And diplomacy is a gradual, slow thing, and yet her need to act quickly is key at various points. So he actually is triggers several really bad situations across the series by not taking the the decisive moment. This is when I will do it, and she's the one who says no now, like, so they're a back and forth, and they're not always happy with each other. In the immediate context, they resolve things over time. And when she reaches for magic, and increasingly accesses that, to me, that's a reflection of her initially a desire to gain greater control of the world. But in the end, it becomes something else for her. It becomes something in the Hittite tradition. Magic, these rites were all about creating harmony on the cosmic level and on the human level and on the world below level. You had to keep all this cosmos together, and balanced. And I think that as a concept, a cultural concept, is something that she gradually begins to understand. So to me, interesting hero, but in the process, she has to really step right straight into danger and lots of places, and has nothing in her background as a priestess, as a noble, daughter, nothing that would prepare her for that. So she really has to force herself to reach and grow and take courage.
So I guess knowing so much about the time period, the historical facts that you've researched and read about and learned about, how much pressure do you put on yourself to remain loyal to those, or I guess what aspects of that period do you try and remain loyal to when you're writing your stories that are fiction?
I know the basic outline of the historical events. And I don't violate those. So, if somebody usurped a throne in such and such a year, and of course I don't have these years in my time span, but I have, I keep the same cycle. I do collapse time because fiction is about fast paced and action, and so I do sometimes collapse years, but so there are key events that I use as a structure. To me, that's really fun because then I can look at that and build a plot. It gives just enough sort of teaser to give me ideas. And my plots always have kind of the imperial scheming and who's in power and which foreign power is sending which spies and all of that kind of undercover part. And then I have the Griffin level of plot. They enter in. They're implied in a small way in the very first book, and then they become a major player in the second book of the series. And there is that plot. This queen, we don't know if she had any siblings. No information about that whatsoever historically. I gave her a sibling. I gave her a sister, and I made her sister blind, and I made her feel responsible for that, which is very important in the first book. But her sister there are a number of different attitudes towards blindness in the ancient world. And I have different characters within the series respond to the sister. Like, so the father has the negative view that this is a curse, that it's a sign that you're damned by the gods, and he's a priest. And so, this is the daughter who, is despicable, et cetera, et cetera. And she, because Tesha feels like, I won't reveal why she feels responsible, but she feels like she caused this blindness through a kind of magical problem. And so, but there's also the view that, you kind of have a deeper understanding. There's the whole Tiresias, the blind seer kind of thing. Now, I don't make the sister a seer, but she's extremely capable. I modeled her on, there are a lot of people who echolocate and use navigational ways to get around and all as blind people, that they just wouldn't describe themselves as disabled or anything like that. They're very content with the way they can navigate and be in the world. And that is the model I use for her. And she is a lot of fun as a character, and her plot line comes together with the Griffins. So the human world and the Griffin world always have this plot line, and it often involves the blind sister, who is a really good sort of the Sherlock and Watson, but Watson was kind of a dummy. But Daniti is not a dummy. She's often like the sort of sidekick when they're trying to figure something out. She's very smart also. They're both very fascinated with puzzles of all kinds, these physical, different kinds of physical puzzles, but also mental puzzles. And so that's initially her sort of side character, and that Daniti carries on. So I have all these different levels of plots going simultaneously, and each of them have their own arc of development of character, and also it's fun.
Did you always know it was going to be 4 books? Was that something planned?
No, I didn't. When I first, I sort of imagined that where this book in the 4th book ended, I thought might originally be a 3-book book, and it just needed more. And the joy of being my own publishing house is that I can choose to write the books the way they really need to be written. So I mean, we've all read those books that were like really long because the person in the middle of the 3-book contract, they just had to shove a bunch of stuff in because there was no way to fit it into 3 books really. So I didn't have that happen. They each have a really nice rhythm to them and end where they're supposed to. And there, I will not say that I would never return to this world. I think that Daniti, as I say, this blind sister, and there are children that the married couple have who are the 4th book, Flights of Treason, that's coming out. One of the main characters is 4, and she has more magic than anybody. And that's not necessarily a grand thing in a 4-year-old. We all know that 4-year-olds don't have the world's greatest control over what they're doing at all times. And so there's another character. So I could imagine having new series that are around this, because I really love this world. Right now, I'm just choosing to bring it. There's a historic moment at the end of this Flights of Treason. That's a nice closing point for it. And it gives people, I think people like to read a series that they know, oh, I'm going to get to the end here. And, if I read these 4 books, then I'll be at the end. And you get that. And that's really nice. And if I open other series out of this, they'll be discreet in their own way that way. So they'll have their own sense of arc and conclusion. But yeah, I didn't know how many it would really be. I mean, as I say, this woman lived to her late 80s and she's only in her 20s at the time this ends. So I haven't gotten through all that much of her reign.
Yes.
Most of the real drama was in the beginning. So, in terms of fiction, it's kind of more fun to concentrate on the times of, people trying to kill off the heir apparent and overthrowing this ruler or that ruler, or, fighting a war with this empire or that empire. Those are all good things for making exciting fantasy fiction. A la Tolkien, as you mentioned earlier, very similar sorts of dynamics, or George R. R. Martin. So
yes, George R. R. Martin is. I mean, he has this strange sort of ability to give us insight into the characters, and then magic is sort of just lurking in the background through various characters, but it's not quite there in the forefront, and that makes for a very enjoyable reading. But I think it's also very interesting what you said, that in the Bronze Age, the time that you are writing about and the culture you're writing about, there are a lot of esoteric rituals which would be viewed as, by modern readers like us, as magic. It's so I was wondering if you could comment a bit, are any of this related to religion, or is it something more abstract, maybe nature worship or more abstract metaphysics?
It's not abstract at all. It's very earthy.
I see.
And it's all religious. So the people who accessed what we would call magic were practicing as priestesses and priests. So, for example, one of the things that Hittites believed all over the place, like we see written records of this, is in curses, and the ability of a sort of dark sorcerer. Interestingly enough, the only crime, this is not quite true, but the primary crime that you could be killed, executed for if you were convicted, was sorcery. Whereas if you just murdered somebody or you tried to overthrow the king, they would banish you to somewhere far away. You had to go away, but they didn't, because of blood guilt and all of that. You don't necessarily finish somebody off. But if they committed sorcery, so sorcery was this really big, fearful thing that they genuinely believed in. When particularly like a royal personage is ill, or failure to, just gradually, we would diagnose some illness or something that we see them gradually dying of. They often thought of that as curses. And they had these very elaborate rites. There's sometimes really peculiarly specific things. So they would draw out the pollution or the curse by making a loaf of bread with like chickpea paste, like hummus inside that would absorb it. Just weird things like that, which when you're trying to create a fictional, magic rite, I had all the raw materials. So, the first time, when she's a very reluctant person, she does not want to remove a curse, but she is forced to, she's part of what she does is use this loaf of bread. Unfortunately, the pollution is in this like corpse that's, like burnt, and it's a burn curse. And I do extend some of this. In the way that, the magic, especially in the early parts where she's just beginning to, she's functioning within her role, as a priestess, and it's a little more historically founded, and then her magic increases over the course of the series. So it's particularly in the beginning, it's almost like a backdrop. It's driving the plot, but it's interesting. I chose the sorcery mostly because it's the one that you can be executed for. So if you accuse somebody of sorcery, and at the very beginning, a key character who will become her, husband in the end, is accused of sorcery because they want to finish him off. Like it's a way of combining human, the kinds of things that human beings do to each other and commit crimes and frame each other and do those sort of things with magic and this ancient context. So I take all the threads as plot elements.
So I guess for some people, how would you define historical fantasy? What is, when you think of historical fantasy, how would you explain it to someone who knows nothing about the subgenre?
Fantasy, I think the real origins of fantasy, I guess we would call mythology and Gilgamesh and, all those kinds of very ancient, where there were monsters and magic because there were gods and whatever. That's not what we really mean when we talk about the fantasy genre. But I would say, like, as Paramita said, Tolkien is kind of the grandfather of the whole genre. And what did he write? As she pointed out, he was a medievalist, and a study of Anglo-Saxon languages, and that's what drove him. So the genre started as medieval Europe centric, that's, you're going to have fairies and elves and all of the magic that is in the folkloric and mythic traditions of medieval Europe. So, okay, that was historical fantasy. So fantasy was historical to begin with. But I think what's happened that's so interesting is that the world building has busted out of, white male centric Europe and gone all around the world. And to me, that's what's so fun. So there were like Ken Liu's The Grace of Kings,
Dandelion
the Dandelion Dynasty. Right. And frankly, part of that is steampunk. He's got like these airships and all, and yet it's a very Asian setting. You're not quite sure where in Asia. It's like mine. It's kind of off planet, and yet it's very much in history and in planet. He has these wonderful pagodas. He uses in the same way that, like, I have a pharaoh. Okay, you know who pharaohs are. You know which kingdom in human history. Every kid knows that, right? But it's not that pharaoh. And it's so Ken Liu did that with Asian history in the same way. And and closer to, like, there's a book, it must be out by now. I read it in its review copy, called The Pomegranate Gate, and it uses Jewish folklore and the Zohar and the Spanish Inquisition and all of that, which is like, yes, it's still Europe, but it is not Tolkien, let me tell you. And all of the fantasy element is this whole kingdom of semi-divine beings that are very much part of the Jewish mystical tradition, and this gate that is in this pomegranate grove, and you move back and forth, and some beings can move back and forth and some can't. And there are humans who have elements of this immortality, this sort of magic in their blood, because there was intermingling of the two worlds, and that's hugely different than Tolkien, and fun, and yet, like what we were talking about, it's got, in this case, it's a whole modern commentary on tyranny and secret police and all of these things, which are so much right now think about Russia and Ukraine and American politics today, and all of those things are in this book in a way, but they're in this fantastical world. It's just not Tolkien's world, and and I love that. I like it that there are these completely different, and there's a bunch of people writing in American context. I don't know if any of you have read Justina Ireland's Rust in the Root. It is,
No.
it's really good. I'm trying to find where my little note on this. So she has this alternate United States in the 30s. Only instead of it being the Depression, it's it's the Great Rust, which was all blamed on Black magicians. There are like mages, and industry was all done by mages, but they're all white. So the whole history of American racism and slavery and all of that gets this alternate, really vivid retake that examines the sort of underlying causes and motivations, and what does it take to get out of that and to create a country that's not mired in all of that anymore. But she does it through this alternate fantastical presentation of it, and to me that's really a refreshing use of history. Is it, it's not I think before we started recording, Paramita asked me how faithful I am, or somebody at some point, how faithful I am. Do I require books to be to a historical moment? And I don't. I like using the historical germ, that little germ in the sense of like a little seed, the food of the seed, and then growing from there. And to me, there's some really exciting things. So I would say that the definition today of historical fantasy is a writer who's willing to incorporate the supernatural or magic in a historical specific context that they build, and they pull the elements, so the clothing and the technologies available and all within Rust in the Root are 30s America, like you recognize from your US history course in high school. Like you get, oh, I know where we are, and yet it's really different, because there are mages, and mages were always around. That's just, and her system of magic arises out of Black folklore traditions, and also Norse folklore. Like, what an interesting that she pulls from both of those. There's a little bit of channeling of Neil Gaiman, like with the whole Norse tradition. But it's also this African, like they throw out seeds and the seed, and cast the spell, and different seeds produce different kinds of constructs and helpers that bring about the magic, and do, like, can be warriors, or they can be whatever. You can turn them into bottles of beer or whatever. So literally, one of the scenes, she helps some bum who's there and needs a beer, produces them with jacaranda seeds, so I think that kind of creative use of history to look at what's going on now, which I would say that's a lot of what I try and do with my Hittite. I mean, I went way back in history, but I don't think that the themes or the driving forces are any different than they are today.
I'm not sure if that should be encouraging or discouraging to know that history. I guess the cliche is, history repeats itself. Is that comforting, or is that discouraging for you to look back and to see the same things are happening over and over again, just in different ways?
Well, maybe this is like, my father always used to say, he was an American historian, and he used to say that democracy works because it doesn't. Like it works because everything, you just keep plodding along, and it goes badly, but then it goes all right. And it goes bad, it goes all right. And that sort of constant, never quite right quality is exactly the best place to be. And it's just a really uncomfortable place to be, which is kind of when I was saying that my main character in this arc, I mean, that's a sort of fundamental lesson, that she cannot control everything. She has got to let go, and trust other people not to screw up, and they will screw up, but still trust them anyway. So I guess that's my view of history, that, yeah, we're going to repeat ourselves. I mean, look at how we go back and we go forward on women's rights, on, rights of anybody whose sexuality is slightly different than the powers that be, those kinds of things. We're just always, it's a give and take. It'd be lovely if we could just go, but then whose straightforward path would that be?
Yeah.
Then you have to hand it over to one decision maker, and that's where trouble happens.
Mhm.
It's, so I don't know. I think the imperfection is a good thing.
Parmitha, did you have a question? I want to hug the mic.
I want to ask you maybe something as a writer. So you mentioned a lot of things you had fun doing. Is there something that was, apart from the initial research which you talked about, was there something in the day-to-day process which was very difficult to do?
Well, in this most recent book, I had written battle scenes before. Of course, there's fighting, swords and spears and all of that. But at the end of this book, and I won't spoil what really happens, but I had to put together a battle scene. It's multi-chapter battle, because it's kind of siege warfare aspect. There's the direct, like battle, these guys with swords are meeting these guys, and at what point in that battle does the arrows enter, like how far do they need to be out, and all those technical questions of you got two lines of men running at each other, how does that work, and what's the geography, what's that they're going over and moving through, and all that. But then there's also this whole magical quality, because I also have sorcerers who at that point are battling one side in what I call Agarian culture, but it's Egyptian mythology. So I get the magic rules from Egyptians there, versus the Hittite side, the Aetolian side. And so they're doing things, and all of these different battles are interacting. And it was so hard. It was great fun. Like, all of these things, obviously, pulling all of these things together is exciting and fun, but keeping the geography clear, and keep, like, wait, I'm a reader. How, what do I see? Which part of this comes in here versus there. To me, that was a really a new job in terms of the scale of it and the juggling these different pieces. I don't know if you've read Guy Gavriel Kay's Tigana. It's another one of
I
those
have.
iconic. Yeah, he had a battle with sorcerers and humans. It's a very different battle than the one I was writing, but I kind of held that book and that the success of that, to me, that ending battle, as if he can do it in my different way, I can do this. So I just kind of kept working until I had balanced it. And it was, in fact, you could read it through and stay in the moment and have it driving forward and not be confused. What's going on? Where am I now? And still preserve that sense of confusion that individuals within the battle have. Because, of course, it's never clear what's going on. And so that was one thing. I guess another, to me, getting all this world building, I know a whole lot, and a very tiny amount of that actually has to be on the page. Otherwise, it's just super slow, right? So knowing how to cull out the detail that will make the whole thing come alive, but just that little bit, and how to connect that so that every time there's a setting detail, it's being perceived through the character as the way that character if they notice it, it's because that's the thing they need to notice then. And it's compelling to them, and so it develops their character, it drives the plot, as well as just happening to create the setting there. So all of those things being hooked together so that there's never a setting description that you just, let me skip that. That's boring.
I see.
Because we all know we do that, right? If somebody goes on and on and on, it's like, nope, I don't want to read that. So learning how to weave those little bits in and put them always in the framework of action and character, even though they might be the floor or, whatever, the windows, where the windows are, what the quality of light in that room is, could be reflecting the inner being, the inner state of the character or whatever. You can hook those things all together and tie them up so that they hold the reader to the page.
How much does I guess the weapons and warfare of that time period, how much does that play into your battle and action scenes that you write? Does it play do you try to remain loyal to those two? How much damage a certain weapon would do, or warfare or siege weapons of that time period? Do you stay loyal to those as well, or do you kind of have liberties with that too?
Well, when the Griffins come into warfare, then they're a whole new thing. They're kind of, on a sort of joking sort of way, they're kind of a nuclear weapon because they're just so much more powerful. So in this battle scene, where they're not, and then maybe they are, they had to have some limitation. If they were going to show up at all, there's going to have to be some profound limitation on what can be accomplished, because otherwise, that annoys me so much in fantasy when you read a book and this person just wrote themselves into a corner and then poof, magic, no, do not solve your plot
When
problems.
the power levels are just completely imbalanced.
Yeah, you have to have and so, as I say, like my Tesha, her magic is really limited, and she gradually, she works really hard. At first, she's just like backing away from it, and then when she's really working at it, she can only gain little bits through hard work. So someone like the Griffins are a whole different category of problem for me that way, that I had to, figure out how to deal with. But in terms of the weapons, like when when her husband Hatu, who was in fact a general, and I know about his battles and how he won them, and it's like chariots over here and infantry there, and I just looked at what historically happened on battlefields, and try and recreate that. Frankly, I love the Iliad. My first novel was based in that whole world, and Homer is really good at super vivid, sword on sword. He's incorporating weapons from like 300, 400 more years. So there's a blending there. And I try and keep mine, the Hittites have Hittite weapons, the Agarians, the Egyptians have Egyptian weapons. There's a key moment in this book, last book, where the recognition of the difference between Egyptian weapons and Hittite, the shapes of swords and things like that, becomes relevant, which is kind of fun. I mean, it's cool that they would have such different shapes of swords. We kind of come from the Tolkien, a big cross-shaped kind of sword thing. No, not most swords. So it's fun to expand what people think of. I sometimes get readers who will say, that's not what it was like. And I just had to smile and say, well, I know. I'm sure you've read things. And that's fine. I'm not going to argue with you. It's like, no, I really do know my weaponry. I don't know how to use them, especially. One of the organizations I belong to is the Historical Novel Society, and they have conferences every other year in the United States and on alternate years in the UK. And they have really fun workshops that are hands-on, like blacksmithing or sword fighting. And I did take the sword fighting, and oh my gosh, it's lucky I am not a medieval warrior or a Hittite, general or warrior, because I'd be dead. I can write it, but I can't do it.
I would like to ask you a question about reading. So
About what?
we talked about reading, about you as a reader. So it's just something that's always lovely to talk about and learn. What was there a book, or are there books that made you want to write, that made you want to create your own world and tell your own stories?
Well, I have to say, most people who are writers, from the time they were in elementary school, they wanted to be writers. And I didn't know that I wanted to be a writer. I didn't want to be a writer for many years. I was being a teacher and a university student and, that kind of thing. And when I started writing, I was bothered by a question that came from, thinking about the Iliad and the ancient Greek world of that. Like, I wanted to know why Briseis in the Iliad, she doesn't get very many lines. She causes the whole conflict in the poem. But she is said to love Achilles, and he's the one who's enslaved her and killed her husband and killed her brothers, and she's not a queen anymore. She's a slave, like, what? Excuse me? What part of that is, a great love? So I was driven more by, so I guess I would say that the Iliad, as a piece of literature that I knew really well, I had, taught it in Greek, and I taught it in English. I really loved it. And I just was like, this has never made sense to me. And ironically, when I started really asking, well, what was this culture? Who would Briseis have been? It wasn't until I found this Hittite connection and realized, well, that's her culture. And there is this priestess, and who was a healing, her function was as a doctor, we would say, as a healer. And we know from the Achilles tradition that he was a healer as well as the best of the warriors. And so I just began finding connections that are imperfect. We were talking about that earlier. Human beings don't match up perfectly, and they aren't, nothing is, she still is really angry at it. I mean, full of grief and for her family and all of that, but she can see something in him that resonates with her, and gradually that builds a bridge between them. But that whole historical culture, I got interested in because of the Iliad. But then I started writing, and I thought, well, there's a lot of this fantasy stuff. And then, I mean, I had read Tolkien and I had read George R. R. Martin and other big people, but I didn't really start reading as widely in fantasy, and particularly historical fantasy, until I was thinking of writing. And I was like, I need to know what people do in this genre, and what are the reader expectations, and when do I want to break those and follow those, and what's my place in this genre. And so I just immersed myself in reading, and I mean, I enjoy lots of genres. I think you mentioned that you read lots and lots of different genres. I love a good mystery,
Yes,
particularly
same.
historical mystery. I know all about different cultures that I never studied. I didn't know anything about them, but because I've read, somebody who's good at writing in that world, I've learned about them. That's great fun to me. What a great way to travel, like pick up a book and, I'm in, Japanese, warrior culture, which I wouldn't have known about. And it's great. So now I read a lot of fantasy and historical fantasy, but I also read, as I say, I love a good mystery, or and there is some literary fiction that comes across that's so well done with character driven that it's really fun to read. So I like some contemporary fiction. I find really good too. So
You mentioned characters being really pivotal to your story. What makes a character compelling for you?
they have to have something that they hold very dear to their sense of self that has to change for them to accomplish what they really know they need to accomplish, or what they have to accomplish. The outside world gets it and they need to get to that point. So to me, a character who is fighting themselves, and has to win that inner battle in order to win the outer one is more compelling. They have to have, to me, a character has to have some internal tools to do that. Like, I write smart women, smart men too, but my central characters tend to be women. I don't know. They're not always, in my Tesha series, her husband is, and his best friend, who is the sort of sidekick on that side of the equation, are militarily really brilliant, but she's not. So, that in terms of who can contribute, it's what she can contribute is she actually is pretty good at military thinking in the abstract. She doesn't know what's going to happen on the battlefield. So of course that can almost be fun. I mean, there are scenes where it's almost funny when they're planning or talking or trying to fix some terrible situation. She will have the out of the box solution that neither of them would have come up with, because she's really bright and she's a good strategist. But there'll also be just like some incredibly goofy, like, no, that will not work.
A
This
logistics
and this.
issue.
Yeah, right.
Fair.
So, so I don't want characters who are, like superheroes. I want characters who are going to bumble along like the rest of us, but with some pretty good, uh, capabilities.
Go ahead, Parmith, if you have a question.
I was going to ask, apart from your own work, when you've been doing reading, what is a series or a book where this character, the character motivations and the character work have really stood across to you and have sort of stayed with you?
Let's see. What lately? Well, I talked about the pomegranate gate, this Jewish
Yes.
folklore, and both of the main characters, the main character who's female and main character who's male, and they're both kind of bumbling in the beginning. Like I'm the the male character is the son of a tailor, and he can't sew in a straight, like like he's not even good at
Aw.
being a tailor. Yeah, um, but they they are thinkers. They don't know they're good thinkers, but they come to trust that. But they learn that the insides of their brain have a lot more going for it than the world has told them. And I think that's interesting. And I think both of those characters um, coming into their own and discovering that they really can meet the challenges that that they face is, to me, interesting
Hmm.
to watch.
How about you, Steve? Character-driven historical setting? I have a very boring answer for this one, which I think pretty much everyone will give, which is A Song of Ice and Fire.
I would
I
have never
have,
guessed that.
I have, I've yet to read something which has that level of character, and because he does this switching POV things, so you spend time in each one's head, and then they evolve through the book. So that's my kind of boring answer.
Well, and I think like the way Jamie is such a
Yes,
villain to begin with, and then isn't,
yes,
gradually you get on his side somewhat, at least, to an extent. But I also think like it's so brilliant that there are so many point of view characters. I try never to
yes,
juggle more than 3 voices in any novel. Um, he does that so successfully. He's always got the name of the character at the top of each
yes,
chapter. But if he didn't, a lot of times you would not need it. Like you hear
yes,
that character so quickly. That's real artistry. He is people say, oh, well, he's, genre fiction or what. He's a really good writer. When I teach,
I agree.
and it's partly that voice that he achieves. It's partly, like there's really brilliant plotting going on. But um but I think being able to redeem characters who you've made everyone hate. I mean, we really hate Jamie. You don't push a kid
Yes,
out a window and then come back from that. You'd think. Like you just wouldn't think that character could ever win our sympathies, and yet he does. And it's not through any single, great heroic thing he does. It's just
hmm,
a gradual slog through back into our hearts. Um, in the same way that, like, Ned gets killed, and we think he's the redeemer of the whole series, like he's the one we can count on, but he's too naive and too, he just doesn't, he's not evil enough. It's going to
Mhm.
take somebody who's a mixture to get anywhere. Um, and that is really, I will agree with you. I would say those characters in those in that series are incredibly complex and brilliantly done.
Hmm.
Steve, how about you?
Other than, well, to not make it 3 in a row, I think Martin does really great characters. I think the other one that comes to mind would be the Dandelion Dynasty, just because
Hmm.
the journey that those
Yes,
characters go through, and even the
yes,
characters that you root against, you at the beginning you end up rooting for later, or you
yeah,
find a
I
way to
totally
connect to
agree.
them. Yeah.
He
I
does
mean, even if,
redemption too.
Mhm.
Yeah.
yeah, and I mean, one example is Gia. I'm not going to give any plot spoilers, but Gia is a very important character throughout the novel and throughout the series. And even when I almost abhor her, I still see her point of view. And that's really, as you said, Steve, like that, and what Judith said as well, that was just so well done.
Yeah, I think you see events happen, and then you question them, or you have a certain I don't say judgment, but you have a certain viewpoint on decisions that were made, and then later on in the series, you see them completely differently. Looking back and seeing what followed those events or what followed those decisions. So I think that's that's really Ken Liu. I don't know. He's on another level. I don't know.
Yeah. There's a reason he won. What is it, the trifecta? He won every single one of the big awards. It's a really good series.
He's a super nice. He's one of the nicest people you'll ever meet too.
Incredibly nice guy.
Very, very nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just just a pleasure to talk to you too. Really, really generous with the time, and can't say enough good things about Ken Liu.
Yeah.
The time has completely flown by. But we have a couple of questions that we'd like to ask our guests just to kind of wrap up. But one of the questions is, was there ever a hobby or thing that you were excited to try, but when you tried it, you did not enjoy it?
Huh. Oh, well, skiing. You would think skiing, and I, as soon as I said that, I can hear my husband laughing in the background. I am I'm not a good skier. But so I ended up being the person, because as I was a teacher, an English teacher, so I always had papers to grade. So I just kept my, hot toddy and stack of papers to essay grade next to the fire, and every hurt child or husband who would come in, and I would take care of that, and then you go away, go back out. So yeah, I tried. It seems like a really fun thing, but I never got very good at it.
No, it's tough. It looks easy. You think it's snow and it won't hurt to fall, but it really does hurt.
And it's just the idea of going down a hill really fast sounds great fun until for me, my son, he would just like aim straight and we could never, they would, at the end of the day, there'd be when he was really little, I mean, later he was fine, but when he was really little, the teacher would have them like inside a snowplow. Like the largest teacher would like try and get him down the hill, because he'd just like shoot straight down. He didn't, he would use somebody to crash into, and it's like, no, you can't do that, dear. That's not how you stop.
It's really tough. It's really tough.
Yeah.
It's not I know people love it, but it's just not fun for me. I don't know.
No.
Yeah.
I'm with you there.
Yeah. Is there a book that you read recently that you really, really loved?
Oh, I would say Stone Blind by Natalie Haynes. There's a whole renaissance right now of mythic retellings, Greek mythology, generally focusing on women. That's actually what I'm writing right now, is a mythic retelling, not Stone Blind. But I think her voice, we were talking about George R. R. Martin's voice. She has this, she's a stand-up comedian and a classicist. There's a combination for you. But that dry humor, even when things are just so bleak in the moment, there's just something. But she redeems Medusa. Like you will see the woman behind the snakes. And I think that's a really intriguing premise.
Wow.
Well, you, Paramita, what's a book you read recently that you really, really loved?
Name of Sixth Time. Oh, does it have to be a new book?
No, it could be anything. Yeah.
Name of the Wind. Sixth Time. Great book. Only sixth time. This is what I posted on the forum. I was like, it's only my sixth time.
I picked up Name of the Wind after hearing Paramita rave about it, and then I picked it up, and she said, "Oh, you shouldn't have bought that."
Steve likes. George R. R. Martin says, I want to write about the human heart in conflict with itself. And Steve likes the bleakest version of that possible. Steve is like, ooh, give me. So, Name of the Wind, I just fear it's going to be very tame for him. He's like, yeah, okay.
I'm not that bad, am I?
You're amazing, but you are not going to love it, in my opinion. Like, after you finish the second Apocalypse reread, then we can talk.
Okay, that's fair.
The second Apocalypse is set during the Crusades, and it's like everybody's just horrible or dying.
Yeah.
This is my elevator pitch. Everybody sucks. The world, everybody. It's just like, what is left? And there are many other people. The series has this cult following, and they're like, "Ooh, give me more than that." And I'm like, "Aren't you traumatized enough yet?" They're like, "No, more."
Yeah.
I scare easy. I'm very, but I did read Berserk, so there's some hope for me.
Yeah. So, one of the questions, Judith, we like to ask our guests is, if the zombie apocalypse started today, what would be your weapon of choice?
Uh-oh. Jeez. What works against a zombie?
We ask the hard questions here.
Yeah. See, this is not my forte. I don't generally fight zombies in the average part of my day. Oh, well, since I love to cook, I will just take my knife block along with me and throw knives. I don't have to get too close to them then. No. Although I'm really not necessarily good aim, but we'll assume there are a lot of them and I'll knock off a few.
Yes, well, it's a good segue to the next question, because the next question was, do you have a favorite family recipe?
Oh, well, let's see. Lots of those. Well, my children made me write down the entire procedure for Thanksgiving. So that's an entire meal that now gets produced generally by everyone. But I guess a version of Julia Child's beef bourguignon is every child knows how to make it. And we have it whenever we get together, from far parts of the world. So I'll say a good beef stew, a la the French.
Oh, nice. You can't really go wrong with stew. Stew is pretty versatile. Yeah. No. It's good all year round. Yeah.
It is. Yeah. All better in the winter.
Yeah. Yeah, usually, yeah.
I actually, I will do a little sales pitchy thing moment here. Because I love to cook and I have food in my, people eat in books, and I like to make food that's authentic. And we actually know what ingredients they had. I won't bore you with how we know that, but there's a lot of data. And I make things before I put them in my books so that I know they really exist. And so I have, if you sign up on my website, which is just my name.com, judithstarkston.com, you get a Griffin novella, yay, free. And then you also, down the road, a couple emails later, you have to keep saying, yes, I want to get emails from this crazy woman. Then you get a cookbook of all the recipes. So it's sort of Mediterranean cuisine a la the Bronze Age. So some really good lamb recipes and, garbanzo beans made different ways and different hummuses and breads and things like that. So fun.
That is hands down the best sales pitch I've ever heard for a newsletter ever. I mean, how can you go wrong?
I was just about to say the same thing. And also, there's a Griffin novella.
Yes.
What?
Yes.
How could I not?
There are no human beings in this novel, but my griffins communicate telepathically. So they are very, they have lots of emotions you will recognize. We will just say that. that human beings can read Griffin novels and have a grand time. It's called the Scent of Slaughter and Love, and
It's a very nice title. But
and
I was there at Griffin Novella.
yeah,
Didn't need any more.
yep. So sign up for my
That is
newsletter,
amazing.
and then hopefully, once people have signed up for my newsletter and they get notification of this or that thing going on, I try and send, good stuff in newsletters, either information that's interesting and fun, or, here's a whole slew of books that people want to give away for free this month. So, here they are, that kind of thing. Right now, it's mostly Flights of Treason is coming out. You can come talk to me in these locations because I'm, on tour or whatever with it. So it shifts what I chat about. I'm lucky if I get one newsletter out a month. I definitely never do more than that, except once in a while when a book is out, but I'm not a fast writer, so that doesn't happen very often. Yeah.
I think one newsletter a month is about right, though. I think you don't want them too often. I mean, you want it to be an event. You want to be something special. So
yeah, and I think as somebody, you were saying you had checked out my website earlier. I do have a website that's got a whole lot of history, the sort of nuts and bolts, popular, easy accessible history about women in the ancient world and what Hittite women did. And I think I have an article on, what is it that's the most popular one? It's about Hittite laws of marriage, adultery, and rape, or something like that. I mean, I just went through talking about them because we know what those laws are. It's interesting. Anyway, my website has a blog that I do some little bit of history or a book review every week. That's a separate sign up, same page, but there's an author newsletter and there's the blog sign up. And the blog you do get every week. So people can choose how much they want and how little they want and what sort. I offer something for everybody.
That's awesome.
I'm being facetious here, but
yeah, that's true. Yeah, I think Paramita, I think we should need to sign up for get the recipes and practice them and compare on the forum about different recipes.
Mine, I'm probably going to. Well, I'm not a good cook, but
neither.
I'll try my best.
Yeah, I mean, I mess up a bowl of cereal.
It's the effort that counts.
Yeah, it's the thought. Yeah. But one of the other questions, Judith, wanted to ask you is, what was your first job, and what did you learn from that experience?
My first job. Oh, it was my very first job was being a counselor at camp, like so many teenagers. And the most profound takeaway I got was, do not walk through poison oak. I had this little group of very short, small kids, and the only way back to camp was through a trail that had poison oak on it. And I carried each one of these kids up over my head over it. Don't do that. That's a very bad strategy.
That must have been painful.
Nobody else got poison oak but me, but I sure did.
That sounds rough. How long did it take to get rid of that? To get rid of the?
Oh, I think it took drugs. I think they gave me steroids or something, like cortisone. Or I had a terrible case of it everywhere. So
that's awful.
Fortunately, I think I must have been 15 at the time. So I was young and dumb. Whatever. You survive. We all survive everything at that age. But
it was a pretty noble thing to do, though, to save the kids from that, right?
Well, their little faces would have been right in that, and that's like, I'm sorry, nobody should.
Yeah, but when I was 15, I was pretty mean. You were very, very sweet and a very good counselor.
Yeah,
to do that, I would have been like, whatever, kids, bye. I'm not good with kids.
I don't believe that. No, that'd be. I can't think of it. I can't think of a counselor who would have done that for me when I was little. So yeah, it's pretty noble. Pretty good thing.
Yeah.
All right.
So yeah. So take solace in that, I guess. But
Yeah, my next job was pot washing, so that was way safer.
oh yeah, yeah. But one of the questions I like to ask too, just to finish up, is if the roles were reversed and you were in our position, was there a question that you would have asked that we did not ask?
No, you guys were pretty good. I think you've been thinking about fantasy a lot and had good questions.
A little bit.
Yeah.
Paramit she's an expert, so I'll just follow her lead.
I had a fun conversation.
Paramit is very well read, so she knows pretty much everything.
That's a euphemism for I read and hate a lot of stuff.
Well, I mean, when you read 1,000 books a year, then you're gonna not like everything, so it's okay. But Judith, thank you so much for coming to spend time with us today. We really appreciate it. We know you're busy, so thank you so much for hanging out with us and telling us about your work.
Yeah, well, thank you, and I hope that people will say, that sounds like a good series. So they'll go to Amazon and find Judith Starkston, and you can. They're all written as standalone. So if you want to read the one that just came out, Flights of Treason, you can start there, or you can start at the beginning, or if you want, which is Priestess of Ashana, or you can go to Troy and read Hand of Fire. So.
Is there a specific place that people can, other than your website, which I'll link down below in the description, is there another place that you prefer people, because I know sometimes you buy books from a certain outlet or certain place that's easier or better to get them from? Is there a place that you prefer?
I am in ebook form. I'm only on Amazon because I'm in KU. So if people are subscribing to KU, go ahead and read there. You don't have to pay. I mean, I'll get paid, but you won't have to. So yay! Let's milk that for all it's worth. But paperbacks are available. If you want to get it from like bookshop.org or wherever, they're all there. And I actually have we talked about seals, and I have the actual seal of the historic queen. I mean, not the actual one, but the archaeologist who excavated it from the ground gave me the precise line drawing, and I created a rubber stamp out of it. So if anybody really, really needs to have a signed copy with the seal, they could write to me, and they could buy it from me and shipping, and then I'll mail it to them with the seal. But other than that, Amazon works.
Oh, that'd be really cool. Yeah.
Yeah. It's fun. At book festivals and stuff, when I'm there, it's a lot of fun to actually sign it with her seal.
Oh, cool. And Paramita, where can people find you?
People can find me on the Page Chewing forum. I post there quite regularly. That's the best place. And I also wanted to thank Judith for such a informative and insightful conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. And you can find me on pagechewing.com in the forums, or all the other links that are listed down below as well. But thank you, Judith, again, and we'll hopefully talk again soon.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hope everyone has a fantastic weekend.
Thanks.